Eklutna is a small Alaska village located within Anchorage. Despite its proximity to Alaska's largest metropolitan center, Eklutna remains remote and sparsely populated, with the tribal council estimating a population of only about 70 residents. The village holds historical and cultural significance for the Dena'ina Athabascan people, the indigenous inhabitants who have occupied this region for generations. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous settlement stretching back over 800 years. The location's most defining characteristic is the Eklutna Lake, a 7-mile-long body of water that serves as the largest lake in Chugach State Park and functions as the primary drinking water reservoir for the city of Anchorage. The area is surrounded by dense forests, glacial features, and terrain that transitions from marshy lowlands to rugged mountain slopes. The Eklutna Lake Road that runs through this region was described by a visitor in 1966 as extremely narrow, unpaved, and fraught with terror, and local residents note that even after paving in 2003, the road remains treacherous enough that the Anchorage School District discontinued bus service to the area, deeming it too dangerous. This remoteness would prove to be precisely the kind of environment that made it attractive to a serial predator seeking to conceal his crimes. The wilderness that locals treasured for its beauty and solitude also provided cover for the most heinous of human acts. On July 17, 1980, a crew of electrical workers conducting routine maintenance along a series of power lines made a discovery that would haunt Alaska law enforcement for decades to come. The workmen were operating in a heavily wooded area located approximately 1 mile south of Eklutna Lake Road. The terrain was dense with vegetation, and the power line corridor they were working along cut through this wilderness like a narrow scar. As the electrical workers went about their duties in this remote location, they encountered something that immediately set them off: a shallow grave containing human remains. The burial was crude and hasty, clearly the work of someone who was in a rush. The grave was shallow enough that natural processes such as decomposition and wildlife activity had begun to expose what lay beneath. The remains were skeletal, indicating that whoever this person was, they had been dead for a considerable period of time before the workers stumbled upon the grave. This was not a fresh crime scene, but rather the long-concealed aftermath of a violent incident that had taken place in what investigators would eventually estimate to be late 1979 or early 1980, potentially as long as a year before the discovery. Upon the discovery of the remains, authorities were called, setting in motion what would become a complex and ultimately frustrating investigation. Among those who responded to the scene was Detective Maxine Farrell, who would later become one of the first law enforcement officials to publicly suggest that a serial killer might be operating in the Anchorage area. The scene presented investigators with significant challenges from the start. The advanced decomposition of the remains meant that many details about the victim, such as her exact appearance, identifying marks, and the precise circumstances of her death, had been lost to time and the harsh elements. However, what officials did have were the clothing and jewelry this young woman wore. Based on these items, Detective Farrell stated that she believed the victim was most likely either a sex worker or a dancer employed in one of the clubs along what the locals call the track. This name refers to Anchorage's strip of bars, nightclubs, and establishments catering to the city's nightlife and adult entertainment industry. The remote location, the shallow burial, and the apparent victim profile all pointed towards something more sinister than an isolated incident. Following the discovery, the remains were transported to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's office in Anchorage for forensic examination. The forensic examination revealed that she was about 5 feet tall. Due to the skeletal state of the remains, her weight could not be determined, though her bone structure suggested a slight build consistent with her short stature. The age estimation placed her between 16 and 25 years old at the time of death. The uncertainty in the age reflects the inherent limitations of forensic technology when working with skeletal remains. Analysis of the skull and other skeletal features indicated that the victim was primarily Caucasian, though the examiners noted she may have had some degree of Native American ancestry or admixture. This finding was notable given the location of the discovery near an Alaska Native village and the significant Native population in the region, though it did not definitively indicate whether she had local ties or had come from elsewhere. Despite the advanced decomposition, investigators were able to recover hair samples that provided a bit more information. The victim's hair was long and ranged in color from light brown to reddish. The autopsy concluded that the victim had died from homicide, specifically from a single stab wound to the back. The victim was wearing a brown leather hip-length jacket, which suggested that she had been killed or abducted during cooler weather. Beneath the jacket, she wore a light-colored sleeveless knit sweater, suggesting that despite the outer layer, she had been dressed for indoor activities or warmer conditions before the incident. On her lower body, the victim wore blue jeans and red or reddish-brown knee-high, high-heeled vinyl boots with a nylon zipper on the side. These boots were striking and memorable and might be worn by someone working in entertainment, dancing, or the nightclub scene. The combination of knee-high height, high heels, and the bright red color made these boots a potentially recognizable item that investigators hoped someone might recall. Within the pocket of her leather jacket, investigators found a box of Salem brand matches. This was a popular brand of menthol cigarettes, and the presence of the matches suggested that the victim may have been a smoker. This detail, while seemingly minor, could potentially help someone who knew her to recognize her habits and confirm a tentative identification. Perhaps the most distinctive and frequently publicized aspects of the case are the multiple pieces of jewelry that the victim was wearing at the time of her death. These items were unusual enough that investigators believe they might be recognized by someone who knew her, and they have been repeatedly featured in media appeals and forensic bulletins over the decades. These included a wide copper bracelet with a stamped floral type design with 3 turquoise stones, a turquoise and brown beaded necklace, and gold-plated metal hoop earrings. On her hand, she also wore a ring and a gold wristwatch. Because the victim carried no identification and could not be immediately matched to any missing person report, investigators and media needed a way to refer to her. Following common practice in such cases, she was given a placeholder name derived from the location where her body was discovered. She was thus named Eklutna Annie. From the moment of discovery, investigators faced substantial obstacles in identifying the victim and solving her murder. The standard investigative approach in unidentified remains cases is to compare the victim's physical description, dental records, and any other available information against reports of missing persons. Investigators ran the victim's profile against missing persons databases in Alaska and beyond, but no match emerged. This lack of a match could indicate several possibilities: that she had never been reported missing, that she had been reported missing under a different description, that she came from outside Alaska and her disappearance was filed in a jurisdiction that did not communicate effectively with Alaskan authorities, or that she was someone whose absence simply was not noticed or prioritized by those who might have reported it. As mentioned earlier, Detective Farrell suspected that Annie was likely tied to the track. Additionally, she actually believed that this victim was merely a single point in a larger web of connected crimes. As time passed following the discovery, Farrell began receiving more reports of missing women in her office, particularly women who fit a similar profile. Young and often working as dancers or workers with limited local relationships. She compiled a list of missing women that eventually included 7 or more names, and she became increasingly convinced that these disappearances were connected, that a serial predator was operating in the Anchorage area, targeting vulnerable women and killing them. However, Farrell's warnings were not well received by her superiors or some of her colleagues in the department. In an interview years later, she recalled the following: "I was talking about Annie to some journalist, I think it was the Anchorage Times, and I said, we got a lot of missing girls, and I got a feeling that maybe there's a serial killer out there. Well, that got in the news right away. My superiors went crazy, so they made me say, I don't think it's that. We have missing girls all the time." This resistance to acknowledging a potential serial killer reflected broader societal attitudes of the era toward victims who worked in such controversial industries. The disappearances of these women were often dismissed as voluntary departures, women who had simply moved on to another city, fallen out of touch with family, or returned to wherever they had come from. The possibility that they were being systematically murdered was not taken as seriously as it should have been, in part because of who the victims were. In the months and years following the discovery, the case remained stubbornly unsolved. However, an intriguing connection would eventually turn up in the form of a man named Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, the firstborn child of Christian Hansen, a Danish immigrant baker, and his American wife Edna. From the very beginning of his life, Hansen seemed destined to struggle. His childhood was marked by profound difficulties that would leave lasting psychological scars. He was born left-handed, but his strict parents forced him to write with his right hand, a common but misguided practice of the era that researchers have since linked to increased stress and developmental difficulties. This forced conversion may have contributed to or exacerbated what became a severe stuttering problem that would plague Hansen throughout his life and contribute significantly to his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and rage. His father, Christian, was by all accounts a strict disciplinarian who demanded much from his son. From an early age, some accounts suggest as young as 12, Robert was required to work long hours in the family bakery, often rising before dawn to help prepare the day's goods. He was paid a pittance for his labor, somewhere between 35 cents and $1 per day, and the grueling work schedule left little time for the social activities that might have helped him develop normal peer relationships. This authoritarian parenting style, combined with the family's strict religious observance and limited financial resources, created an environment of isolation and resentment that Robert carried with him into adulthood. Adding to his social difficulties was a severe case of acne that ravaged his face throughout adolescence, leaving him permanently scarred and, in his own words, feeling like, quote, one big pimple. The combination of his speech impediment, his acne-scarred face, his small stature, and his lack of social skills made him an easy target for bullying and ridicule by his classmates, particularly the girls whose attention and affection he desperately craved. This pattern of rejection by women would become a central psychological driver of his later crimes. In school, Robert was described as a quiet loner who had difficulty connecting with his peers. He participated in some activities, including boys' chorus, pep club, and track, where he lettered in long-distance running and broad jump, but he never achieved the social acceptance he yearned for. His name was even misspelled in his high school yearbook when he graduated in 1957 as part of a class of only 31 students. The solitary activities that Robert turned to as a refuge from his painful social world would later become the tools of his killing spree. He developed exceptional skills in hunting, fishing, and archery, pursuits that allowed him to spend time alone in nature, away from the mockery of his peers, and to exercise control and dominance over his environment in ways he could not achieve in human relationships. These outdoor skills would eventually make him a celebrated trophy hunter in Alaska, but they would also provide him with the expertise he needed to track and kill human prey. The first major indication of the violence simmering within Robert came on December 7, 1960, when he committed an act of revenge against the community he felt had wronged him. On that date, he was then serving as a volunteer firefighter in Pocahontas, Iowa, and set fire to the local school bus garage. Robert actually showed up first to fight the blaze he had started, playing the role of hero while secretly knowing he was the villain. He was caught when a friend turned him in, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served only 20 months of the sentence at Anamosa State Penitentiary, but during his incarceration, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation that would prove eerily ominous. The examining psychiatrist diagnosed him with bipolar disorder, then called manic depression, with periodic schizophrenic episodes, and noted that he possessed an infantile personality characterized by an obsession with getting back at people he felt had wronged him. Despite these alarming findings, Robert was released, and his first wife, ashamed of his criminal behavior, divorced him. The years following his release from prison saw Robert drift through a series of petty crimes and failed attempts at normalcy. He was arrested several times for theft, and in 1963, he met and married his second wife, with whom he would eventually have 2 children. In 1967, seeking a fresh start away from the community that knew his criminal history, he moved his family to Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska in 1967 seemed to offer everything Robert had been looking for. The state's vast wilderness provided unlimited opportunities for the hunting and outdoor pursuits he loved, and the frontier atmosphere of Anchorage allowed him to reinvent himself as a respectable citizen. He opened his own bakery and quickly earned a reputation as a skilled outdoorsman, setting multiple hunting records that were entered into the prestigious Pope and Young Trophy Hunting World Record books in 1969, 1970, and 1971. But the violence that had surfaced in the arson incident continued to manifest itself. In December 1971, Robert was arrested twice in quick succession, first for abducting and attempting to rape an unidentified housewife, and then for an unidentified sex worker. He pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon in the first case, and the charge in the second was dropped as part of a plea bargain. Robert was sentenced to 5 years in prison but served only 6 months before being released to a halfway house on a work release program, a pattern of lenient treatment that would recur throughout his criminal history. In 1976, Robert was arrested again, this time for stealing a chainsaw from an Anchorage Fred Meyer store. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to receive psychiatric treatment for his bipolar disorder, but the Alaska Supreme Court reduced his sentence, and he was released with time served. During this incarceration, a prison psychiatrist again noted his mental health issues, but the court order requiring him to take lithium to control his mood swings was never enforced. By 1980, Robert had been arrested multiple times for crimes involving violence against women and had spent time in prison for arson and theft. He had been diagnosed with serious mental health conditions and identified as having an obsessive desire for revenge against those who he felt had wronged him. Yet each time, the system released him back into society, where he returned to his double life as a respected baker and family man by day and a predator by night. Authorities believe Robert began killing around 1971 or 1972, though the precise date of his first murder remains disputed. What is known with certainty is that over approximately 12 years, he developed and refined a methodical approach to abduction, and murder that combined his hunting skills with his deep-seated rage against women. His preferred victims were the women working along the city's nightlife strip. He selected these women deliberately, understanding that their transient lifestyles and marginalized social status made them ideal targets. The typical abduction followed a consistent pattern. He would approach a woman and offer her money, often for sex or for posing for photographs. When the woman got into his vehicle, he would produce a weapon, typically a handgun, and immediately take control of the situation. In his own words, he would say something like, "Look, you're a professional. You don't get excited. You know there is some risk to what you've been doing. If you do exactly what I tell you, you're not going to get hurt." Once he had the woman under his control, he would typically take her to his home in the Muldoon neighborhood of Anchorage, an upper middle class area where he lived with his wife and 2 children who remained completely unaware of his crimes. There, he would handcuff and bind his victim, often using bandages as blindfolds, and subject her to hours of torture. Hansen kept the windows of his home fitted with bars, which he explained to victims as a security measure, but which actually served to prevent escape. After assaulting his victims, Robert often transported them to remote wilderness locations, frequently using the private airplane that he had purchased in January 1982. He would fly to the area around the Nick River or to his remote cabin, accessible only by bush plane, where the real horror would begin. What made Hansen's crimes uniquely terrifying was what came next. He would strip his victims naked, sometimes blindfold them, and release them into the Alaskan wilderness. He would give them a brief head start, and then hunt them down with a rifle, just as he had hunted the animals that filled his trophy room. The hunting grounds were carefully chosen. The Nick River Valley, the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, and the areas around Seward and Resurrection Bay offered the perfect combination of remoteness and accessibility that his crimes required. Just 25 miles from Anchorage, the Nick River Valley was a preferred hunting ground for veteran trophy hunters, with terrain including gorges and valleys where bodies could be hidden for years. Robert knew these areas intimately from his legitimate hunting expeditions, and he used this knowledge to select burial sites where discovery would be unlikely. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, women continued to disappear from Anchorage's nightlife scene, and bodies began appearing in the wilderness surrounding the city. The first discovered victim connected to what would eventually be recognized as a serial murder case was the woman we were previously discussing. Later that same year, the body of Joanna Messina, a 24-year-old exotic dancer, was discovered in a gravel pit near Seward. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty Anchorage police officers, John Daly and Audie Holloway, were hunting along the Nick River when they noticed a boot sticking out of a sandbar. Upon closer inspection, they discovered a partially decomposed bone joint protruding from the sand. They had stumbled upon the grave of 23-year-old Sherry Morrow, a dancer from the Wild Cherry Bar who had disappeared on November 17, 1981, after telling friends that she was going to meet a man who had offered her $300 to pose for photographs. The autopsy on Sherry Morrow revealed crucial forensic evidence. She had been killed by 3 gunshot wounds from 2.23 caliber bullets, ammunition typically used in high-powered rifles. Ace bandages mingled with her remains suggested she had been blindfolded at the time of her death, and the fact that her body was found fully clothed despite no bullet holes in her clothing indicated she had been shot while naked and then redressed before burial. The discovery of Morrow's body prompted investigators to look more closely at the growing number of missing women cases in Anchorage. Working together, the Alaska State Troopers and Anchorage Police Department began comparing files and notes, and patterns started to emerge. Sergeant Lyle Haugsven, later succeeded by Sergeant Glenn Flood, led the investigation into whether these cases might be connected. On September 2, 1983, just 10 days before Sherry was discovered, another body was found along the Nick River. This victim was identified as 17-year-old Paula Goulding, an exotic dancer and sex worker who had been missing for 5 months. Like Sherry, she had been shot with the same caliber bullet. Investigators were now convinced that they were dealing with a serial killer. The break that would finally bring Robert Hansen to justice came on June 13, 1983, when he made a critical mistake. Cindy Paulson was a young dancer and sex worker living in Anchorage with her mother. On that June night, she was working along 4th Avenue when a middle-aged man in a car pulled up and propositioned her, offering $200 for oral sex. Paulson agreed and got into the vehicle, but the moment she did, everything changed. Robert immediately pulled a gun and placed handcuffs around one of Paulson's wrists. He drove the girl to his home in Muldoon, where he chained her by the neck to a post in his basement and subjected her to hours of rape and torture. Throughout the ordeal, Paulson forced herself to remain observant, memorizing details of the house such as the bars on the windows, a bullet hole in the floor, and, crucially, Robert's hunting trophies, on which his real name was clearly displayed. Robert had initially told her his name was Don, but when Paulson saw his actual name on the trophies, she realized he intended to kill her because she now knew his true identity. After several hours, Robert told Paulson he was going to fly her to his cabin in the mountains. He said if she cooperated, he would let her go afterward, but Paulson knew this was a lie. At approximately 5 a.m. on June 14th, they drove to Merrill Field, a small airport on the outskirts of Anchorage where his Piper Super Cub was parked. Still handcuffed, Paulson was placed in the backseat of his car while Robert got out to fuel and load his airplane. Before leaving, he warned her that if she tried to run, he would kill her, but Paulson had already decided she had nothing to lose. When Robert turned his back to load cargo into the cockpit, she threw herself into the driver's seat, managed to open the door despite her handcuffs, and ran barefoot toward the nearest street. Robert turned around and gave chase, yelling at her to stop, but Paulson kept running until she reached 6th Avenue. At that moment, fate intervened in the form of Robert Yunt, a truck driver who just happened to be passing by. Seeing a disheveled young woman in handcuffs frantically waving her arms, Yunt pulled over and offered assistance. He drove Paulson to the Big Timber Motel where her boyfriend was staying. Still in handcuffs, Paulson had the front desk clerk call her friend while Yunt continued on to work, where he immediately called the Anchorage Police Department to report what he had witnessed. Back at Merrill Field, Robert hurried back to his car to flee the scene, but an observant security guard had noticed the suspicious activity and written down the license plate number and description of his vehicle. When Anchorage police officers arrived at the Big Timber Motel, they found Paulson in room 110, still handcuffed and alone. She provided a remarkably detailed account of her ordeal, describing Robert's car, the interior of his home, the street it was on, and specific details about the firearm he had used to threaten her. Officers drove her to the hospital, and en route, they passed Merrill Field. Paulson recognized the area and directed officers to the exact location where Robert's blue and white airplane was still parked. Between the registration on the plane, the license plate number noted by the security guard, and confirmation from the Federal Aviation Administration, investigators quickly identified the owner as Robert C. Hansen, a local baker who lived on Old Harbor Road in Muldoon. Police then visited his residence to question him, but he denied everything. He claimed to have never met Paulson and suggested she was trying to shake him down for money. Robert stated that his wife and children were vacationing in Europe and claimed he had spent the entire evening with two friends. When police checked Robert's alibi, it appeared to hold up. Faced with a conflicting story between a respectable businessman and family man on one side and a teenage prostitute on the other, police initially declined to pursue charges. Robert had gotten away with it again. However, by late summer 1983, the FBI sent Special Agent John Douglas, who was a celebrated criminal profiler. He quickly developed a profile for the killer of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding, and eventually realized that Robert Hansen almost fit his profile perfectly. The key to breaking the case lay in Robert's alibi. Douglas suspected that Robert's friends had lied for him and encouraged detectives to bring them in for questioning, threatening them with charges if their stories proved false. The strategy worked. Under pressure, both men admitted that they had not been with Robert on the night Cindy Paulson was abducted. It was also learned that Robert had committed insurance fraud, a burglary he had reported to police years earlier in which hunting trophies were allegedly stolen from his home had never actually occurred. Robert had hidden the items in his basement and collected the insurance payout, using the money to open his bakery. This discovery provided additional evidence of Robert's willingness to deceive and his pattern of criminal behavior. Armed with Paulson's testimony, Douglas's profile, and the knowledge that Robert's alibi was false, investigators went before Judge Victor Carlson with a 48-page affidavit requesting search warrants for Robert's home, vehicles, and aircraft. On October 27, 1983, the warrants were issued and investigators moved in. That morning, investigators followed Robert to his bakery and asked him to accompany them to the police station for questioning. He agreed without asking why they wanted to talk to him. Simultaneously, two teams of investigators served the warrants on his house and airplane. The search of his home initially seemed disappointing. Officers found numerous weapons throughout the house, but nothing that directly connected Robert to the murders. As the day wore on and the search seemed to be producing nothing incriminating, one investigator decided to check the attic one more time. There, tucked away in a hidden space in the rafters, he discovered a concealed cache that would blow the case wide open. Inside the hidden compartment, investigators found an arsenal of weapons, including a Remington rifle, a Thompson contender pistol, and a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun. They also discovered various pieces of jewelry, newspaper clippings about missing women, a driver's license, and identification cards, some of which belonged to women who had disappeared. Among the jewelry was a distinctive fish necklace that had belonged to Andrea Altier, a 24-year-old woman who had vanished in December 1981, but the most damning pieces of evidence were yet to come. First was an aviation chart with 37 X marks written on it. These marks were immediately suspected to correspond to locations where bodies had been buried. And finally, hidden among the weapons was the same caliber rifle that had been used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. Following the search, Robert was formally arrested and charged with assault, kidnapping, multiple weapons offenses, theft, and insurance fraud. On November 3, 1983, an Anchorage grand jury returned 4 indictments against him. Investigators were still waiting for ballistics results from the FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C., so murder charges were temporarily held in reserve. Robert pleaded not guilty to all charges and bail was set at $500,000. It was during further questioning that Robert admitted to killing Annie. However, he had no idea who the woman actually was. According to his own account, as summarized in official reports and secondary sources, Robert picked up the victim somewhere in downtown Anchorage. He claimed she was wearing blue jeans, a sweater, and a brown leather jacket, a description consistent with what was found at the scene. He believed she was either an exotic dancer or a worker working in Anchorage's nightlife scene. At some point during their interaction, he claimed she may have mentioned she or her family were from Kodiak, Alaska, though this detail remains unverified. What happened next, according to Robert's account, began with deception but escalated to violence. He told her he was taking her to his home, but instead drove toward the Eklutna Lake area. When she realized that they were not heading toward his house, she became upset and asked to be returned to Anchorage. He responded by pulling a gun and told her to do as he said, and she would not be hurt. At some point, his vehicle became stuck near muddy or swampy terrain off a remote road near the lake. He persuaded her to help him try to free the truck from the mud, but when the vehicle began to move, she attempted to flee. Robert chased her, grabbed her by the hair, and brought her down. As she struggled and reportedly pleaded to be spared, he stabbed her once in the back with a black-handled buck knife, killing her instantly. He then buried her shallowly along the power lines, where she was discovered roughly a year later. Although Robert claimed she was his first murder victim in this series, law enforcement and researchers have long suspected he may have killed other women earlier, potentially including cases like Celia Van Zanten, Megan Emmerich, and others. But these attributions remain unproven or disputed, and Robert himself denied responsibility for some suspected killings. Robert Hansen ultimately confessed to murdering at least 17 women, and 12 bodies were recovered from locations he identified. Over the decades following his arrest, investigators worked to identify the recovered victims, but two of them presented particular challenges: Horseshoe Harriet and Annie, who remained unidentified for extended periods despite intensive efforts. On February 18, 1984, Robert Hansen pleaded guilty in Anchorage Superior Court to 4 counts of first-degree murder in the cases of Paula Goulding, Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Annie. 9 days later, on February 27th, Superior Court Judge Ralph E. Moody sentenced Hansen to 461 years in prison plus life, without possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Moody did not mince words about the failures of the criminal justice system that had allowed Robert to operate for so long. Noting his extensive prior history of arrests and short prison sentences for crimes involving violence against women, the judge declared, "I cannot conceive of a more profound indictment of society than what we have here." Robert Hansen remained incarcerated in Alaska for the rest of his life. In May 2014, suffering from declining health, he was transferred from Spring Creek to the Anchorage Correctional Complex for medical care. On August 21, 2014, at the age of 75, Robert died at Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage from natural causes related to his deteriorating health conditions.